And hello, people online. One of the things that I've really enjoyed about the time at Archbold has been recruiting some really good people into the Archbold family. And I hope that's some of what we're going to do here today. Maybe a year and a half ago, Adam Pellegrini, assistant professor at the University of Cambridge right now, posted on, I think, his account on the formerly known as Twitter website about a newly funded project working around the world on global rangeland carbon and fire and grazing. And I wrote to him and I said, well, why the heck is Archbold not in this? It was an oversight, I think. But we quickly fixed that. And his wonderful postdoc, Courtney Courier, has been here twice now since then, working on both the station and the reserve. So I think he's going to talk a little bit about that project today. Adam, like I said, is an assistant professor at Cambridge now. He is on his way moving to Stanford University next fall. I've had the privilege of knowing him for many years now. He was 1 year ahead of me in graduate school at Princeton and was a very friendly mentoring type, I'll even say, when I started. Brought me on board the culture there and pointed me to a couple of good, useful projects. So I will always appreciate. For younger folks in the room who maybe are heading off to graduate school before long, I recommend finding someone like that who can get you going. Before his time at Princeton, he was an undergraduate at Colgate University. And after his time at Princeton, he held two postdocs, one NOAA-funded postdoc at Stanford University, where he'll be going back to. So without any more introduction, we're excited to have him, and I'll turn it over to you, Adam.
Thanks, Josh. And I have great stories about Josh if anybody's interested in that over question time. Okay, so yeah, the title of my talk is Digging Deeper, a critical review of climate solutions using soil carbon sequestration. And just to give a brief background about myself, my training is in ecologist and biogeochemist specifically. And I started to get interested in more applied work during my postdoc when there are a lot of folks around that were interested in thinking through refining this idea of the land carbon sink. And that, of course, has exploded in research. In many cases, people are thinking about trying to manage ecosystems for carbon in order to get money to either for themselves and their livelihood, or to sustain things like conservation organizations, et cetera. So I thought it would be an interesting area of research to go into. And today I'm going to be talking more so about a large project where we evaluated one particular nature-based solution. But first, I'm going to just give a brief background. And I'll say, if you need me to clarify anything, repeat anything, etc., just feel free to raise your hand or interrupt me. But the premise of this is that it's been proposed that managing land to either remove carbon dioxide or protecting it so it doesn't lose as much carbon dioxide could be a substantial way of buffering against rising emissions and slowing the pace of climate change. And there's a number of different ways to do this, but one set of management strategies is referred to as nature-based climate solutions or natural climate solutions. And the key thing there is that they're proposed to both sequester carbon or avoid emissions, as well as not harming things like food security and production or biodiversity. And a recent estimate puts the potential value of nature-based climate solutions of removing 10 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalents per year. So given that humans are emitting around 50 gigatons of CO2 equivalent per year, this is a big number. And it's split across these sort of different categories of avoided emissions. So don't chop down rainforests, don't drain a peatland, as well as enhanced sinks, like restore the system. But underneath those clean numbers, that 10 gigaton number, there's a load of variability. So this graph here, what you're looking at in each row are different CO2 removal pathways. And on the x-axis here is the greenhouse gas mitigation potential in terms of gigatons of CO2 per year. And the width of the bands basically tells you all the different estimates that exist in the literature. So this is taken from one of the more recent IPCC reports. And the numbers to the right of that band tell you the range in values. And each of the dots shows you a different estimate. So, maybe my study showed X and Josh's study showed Y, they would each be dots. And the key takeaway here is that all of these numbers are pretty big, right? They're all getting into the gigaton land, but they're massively variable. They're spanning an order of magnitude. So I'd say there's a lot of work to do to try to constrain the potential. And I think to unpack why some of these estimates vary, it's useful to think through the process by which nature-based solutions are calculated. And I've really generalized here, but they use maps of current land use types. So that's determining the current state. They make assumptions about how it might change and then calculate the carbon in the ecosystem that it could change into. Now, to do this, models, either empirical or process-based, are used to determine a number of different things. So one of the key components is what's the biophysical capacity for storing carbon in the system? How much does it have currently? What are the necessary modifications that you'd need to make to that system to try to store more carbon? And so that would be the implications of change. And then one thing that studies have done, that fewer studies have done, but it's becoming more and more apparent that they're important, is thinking about what are the downstream emissions. So this would be things like displaced production and leakage, et cetera. So you need to basically go across the board and do a series of pretty difficult calculations that require a lot of generalizations. And to unpack some of those today and talk about both the opportunities as well as the pitfalls, I'm going to be focusing on modified grazing. So many of you probably know livestock contribute 14% to annual anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. So this is a massive flux. And the idea behind modified grazing is essentially you're managing livestock either in their densities or in how they're grazing a landscape to change the productivity of plants in that landscape that can then change soil carbon sequestration. So there's a number of different grazing practices that have been proposed to shift plant biomass productivity, but one of the most commonly focused on practices in these global nature-based solution analyses is simply changing livestock density. So this little cow on the left is alone, but as a consequence, there's a lot of grass biomass, there's a lot of root biomass, you store more soil content. And that's one of the prevailing hypotheses. So today I'm going to go through three different ways of dissecting this potential. First, I'm going to just try to put a number on the amount of carbon dioxide that could be sequestered by modified grazing. And then I'm going to talk about where are these solutions effective and what determines that. And then finally, thinking about how do net emissions change in the entire system, right? When you think about grazing and you start talking about food production, you have to consider a number of different processes like supply chains and what the emissions are within those. So I'm going to be talking about work from two folks in my lab. Courtney is a postdoc who Josh was talking about. She's leading a big empirical side of this project. So I'm really going to be focusing on the high level meta-analysis, sort of cringy generalizations that take place, but Courtney is trying to really nail down the mechanisms, and I'm happy to talk about her work afterwards. But what Robert's been doing, he's a PhD student, is he's been conducting both a meta-analysis of studies that have altered grazer densities across 333 sites with 838 comparisons. So within a site, they may have multiple levels of grazing treatment, et cetera. And specifically, these are areas that measured both changes in plant biomass as well as changes in soil organic carbon, so that we're able to try to connect the dots between how shifts in grazing intensity, in this case, or grazing density, affects plant biomass, and in turn, how that changes soil carbon. So if you look across all of these sites, and I should take a step back. I'm going to be talking primarily about rangelands, not intensively managed pastures. So these aren't pasture fields that are getting nitrogen fertilizer, et cetera. These are generally areas that might be not very productive, not productive enough for like massive agricultural development, et cetera. So livestock is their the primary thing that's grown there. So when all studies were compared, we found that sure enough, there's broad evidence that when you reduce the density of grazers, you can store more plant biomass and more soil carbon. So this isn't surprising given all the work that's been done in the field. Okay, there we go. So on the y-axis, you're looking at percent changes in low versus high livestock density. And I've broken this down between the shoots, so above ground plant biomass, the roots, total plant biomass, and then soil. So this is soil organic carbon. Now, a very frustrating thing about all of these studies is that they don't report some comparable metric of what grazing intensity is. They don't even tell you the density of the livestock. In some cases, they don't tell you what livestock were even there. So bear with me as I go through these calculations, in that one reason why I'm talking in these general terms is to try to not fool myself or fool ourselves into thinking actually being more specific and precise than we really are. But the key thing is that when we're looking at changes in plant biomass, namely things like above ground biomass production, and changes in soil carbon, we can say, all right, when you see a change in plant biomass of some amount, how much does soil carbon change? And then take a step back and say, all right, if you change livestock or grazer density in some way, and this shifts plant biomass, we would predict soil carbon to change. And so one way to get it that relationship is doing a large machine learning analysis of variable importance and evaluating the relationship between covariates and what that means for soil carbon gains. So I'll walk you through this. So on the left-hand side, you're looking at a variable importance graph where it's showing a number of different variables that we have in our model that's predicting total soil carbon change. And the length of this bar is effectively telling you how important that variable is. There's a number of different ways of estimating this, but in this case, it's showing the number of models that it pops out as being included in and its actual importance. So just to give you an idea for some of these relationships, first of all, soil carbon concentration popped out as being the most important variable. And we're not plotting a variable on to itself. This is the baseline soil carbon concentration in the control plot, so in the low density plot. And the idea there is to try to capture like how soil carbon might change with altered livestock density in soils of different underlying organic matter contents and different fertilities. And what we found is that you basically see this precipitous decline as you begin to increase carbon concentration in the soil, where you see large gains in carbon in soils that have low starting carbon concentrations, but then it really plateaus, but stays, above zero until you get to really high concentrations. Now, the other variable that popped out was biomass change. So the amount that plant biomass changed in that experiment. And what you can see here is, again, a nonlinear relationship, but importantly, this is positive, where in the sites that experienced the largest gains in plant biomass, they also experienced the largest gains in soil carbon. So this is interesting because this gives us a nice platform for saying, okay, if we're able to either measure or model how differences in grazing or livestock densities, et cetera, change plant biomass, then we can begin to try to predict changes in soil carbon. And a number of other variables popped out as being important, and I can talk about those as well. But one thing that I'll just mention is that a lot of the statistical methods that exist in the literature are really bad. And the reason why they're bad is because they don't take into, there's also a lot of really good ones, is because they don't take into account this idea of spatial autocorrelation in the response, where if you're working in one area and you're measuring the effect of an experimental manipulation, you doing it in an area that's nearby is more likely to, or that area that's nearby is more likely to respond in the same way as this area than if you were doing the experiment in Mongolia. In some times that's not the case, right? That's a hypothesis. But in the case of rangeland grazing experiments, that is the case. And so what you're looking at here is basically a plot of the model fit. And we did two different models. We first did this random cross validation. So that's saying, all right, train our model on 75% of our data, predict the other 25% and see how good the model does. And we'll just do that randomly. Another one, and that gives us a nice R-squared, that's 0.43. And that is the majority of the methods that, that is the method in the majority of studies that have actually estimated nature-based solution potential at the global scale. Now, the other option is to do this spatially buffered leave one out cross-validation. Mouthful, but what that does is it says, all right, the data that we're training our model on and testing that model on need to be far apart from one another. And when you do that, your R-squared drops in half. And so how do you deal with this? Now all of a sudden you have a model that's performing poorly. Well, you try to predict in areas that you have high confidence in. So you're not, if you have a bunch of data points in one area, you're not trying to extrapolate to an area that's very far away, even if it might have similar environmental conditions because of the spatial autocorrelation. So that's just something to chew on. A lot of these papers appeared in Science and Nature that use just this random cross-validation. And so we think they should probably be redone. But when we put that, when we take our model and we integrate a number of different covariates that were important, so precipitation seasonality, underlying soil carbon concentration, soil nitrogen, different climate variables, etc., we found that we estimated that the carbon storage potential from reduced grazing was around 1.37 petagrams of CO2 per year. So this is a petagram is the same as a gigaton. And importantly, you should be asking yourself, all right, you have this annual flux, how long is that going to be lasting for? The mean duration of our studies were around 11 years. So I wouldn't confidently say, we would be able to sequester this amount, indefinitely, of course. But what you can see from this is that there's massive amounts of geographic heterogeneity, right? So these are estimates, again, massed to all the areas with rangeland. And in some locations, you see very high potential to store carbon in plants and soils. like in the Cerrado in Brazil, as well as in equatorial Africa, throughout China, etc. But then some of the largest tracts of grazing lands, like in far southern Africa, as well as the western US and parts of Eurasia, the changes are relatively modest. So from that, I would say that CO2 removal in plants and soils is possible from reduced grazing pressure. And the efficacy of this removal is highest in degraded areas, so things, sites that are low in soil carbon. And it's also, so that's the high potential in these degraded areas, but it's also low in many areas. In some cases, many of the areas that sort of altered grazing management projects are being carried out in. Well, I'm going, yeah, okay, the timer's off. Initially, I thought I was going really slowly. Maybe I am. So now I want to talk about where the solution's effective at removing carbon dioxide. And so to do this, we needed to use models. And specifically, we use the IPCC Tier 2 model. So this integrates things like what are the identities of the different livestock that are present in an area, how much feed are they consuming, what's the productivity of forage in that area, what's the ratio between forage to feed composition, what's the population density and management of these livestock. And so this is, there's well over 100 equations that go into these estimates, but basically you can use maps of the production systems and livestock densities and composition and all these variables that I'm talking about to estimate the amount of forage relative to demand. So this allows us to calculate this idea of a relative stocking density. So it tells us in an area, if we're going to try to reduce grazing intensity, it needs to already be being grazed at a high amount to begin with, right? You don't want to say you can store carbon in this area by reducing grazing intensity if the intensity is already low. And so what this map is showing is basically these are low intensity grazed areas, the orange is medium, and then the black is high intensity. And what we found is that if you're going to reduce grazing intensity in an area to grow enough plant biomass that you can store enough soil carbon to get to that 1.3 gigaton of CO2 per year number, you have to massively reduce the amount of plant biomass that's being consumed. So on this left-hand side, you're looking at the change in plant biomass consumed, the megatons per year. And we did a few different grazing plant productivity sensitivity analysis. I'm happy to talk about those afterwards, but basically we evaluated scenarios like, okay, what happens if productivity of forage increases when you increase stocking density, something that's hypothesized in the literature. And I'm happy to elaborate on that. But effectively, when you look across the globe, the main livestock that's important for this are cattle. So sheep and goats pop up onto there, but really cattle and changing their consumption of plant biomass is what's going to move the needle. And you can see geographically, there's also a lot of variability where some of the greatest reductions in plant biomass consumption need to be in Africa as well as in South America. Yeah, okay, that's a great question. So it's two different scenarios in how we model plant productivity. So there's a hypothesis that if you are grazing things at low intensity and you increase the productivity so it's low intensity and you increase the intensity of grazing, you can actually increase the productivity of plants. So that's one hypothesis in the literature. The other hypothesis in the literature is that the amount of plant biomass that's there is simply proportional to the amount of grazers that are there. So the bar on the left is showing the scenario where plant productivity can change with shifts in grazing intensity. The bar on the right is that it's all proportional. And so the bar on the right, the reason why that's important is because that's what goes into like the IPCC estimates. Does that make sense? More sense? Okay. So if you're going to reduce the amount of plant biomass that's consumed by livestock, grazers, etc., and not change food production, they need to get their calories from somewhere, right? We're not talking about culling all the livestock in order to sequester soil carbon. And one option for that is giving them feed, right? Shifting them from eating the grass on the field to being supplemented with feed. Now, the problem with that, though, is that feed embodies large greenhouse gas emissions. But this varies it varies a very high amount across different countries. And the way that we calculated this feed emissions, which are going to be important, is we took a global trade data set that says, all right, if you're the United States, where are you getting your feed from and how much of it, what grain type is it, etc. And we combine that with a bookkeeping land use change model to estimate the emissions that went into producing that feed. So you can see, all right, feed that is produced in all these countries that are bluer or redder, that's going to have a much higher emission intensity than feed that's produced in some of these more pinky colored countries. So the whole point here is that depending on where you're getting your feed, you can have vastly different emissions associated with it. And one of the really important driving factors in this is trade. So we did a counterfactual scenario where we said, okay, we know where these countries are getting their feed that they're feeding to livestock. So that's from the Food and Agricultural Organization as well as the World Bank. And what happens if we switched everything to just domestic consumption? So we're only going to eat the things that we produce domestically, and we compare those two to one another. And when you look at that across the globe, all these countries that pop out as red, those are countries where because they're importing feed from carbon emission intensive regions, the feed emissions are so high that it's going to outpace any sort of carbon sequestration in plants and soils. And this is just a distribution of some of the largest countries that we estimate you could get soil carbon sequestration. Now, the key thing here, though, is I'm not saying this is the only pathway that you can increase soil carbon sequestration with altered grazing. This is just one of the pathways that have been proposed where you supplement their diet with feed. So CO2 removal can be, has high potential in heavily grazed areas, primarily by cattle in South America and Africa, but that feed supplementation really limits the efficacy of the CO2 removal, and it's mediated by trade. So if countries were to source their feed from different locations and optimize that, they could really reduce the net emissions and increase the climate benefits. So, all right, how do net emissions change? What happens when we put all of that together? Well, what I'm showing you here is on the y-axis, the emissions over 11 years. So this is, we summed it through 11 years because that's the average duration of the studies in our data set. And these are just two of those scenarios that I was talking about. You can supplement it with feed, or you can optimize grazing, where you change the density of livestock in a way that you basically get to a point where you've maximized net primary productivity of the plants, but you haven't, overly reduced your livestock density without changing net primary productivity anymore. And all these bars with their different colors are just showing the different fluxes and the different fluxes. So everything below the 0 line is the sink of greenhouse gases. So you have your soil carbon storage, you have your biomass carbon. Here, what I'm talking about with livestock emissions, you see it's below the 0 line. You may be saying, what? Methane and nitrous oxide are really bad for the atmosphere. But when livestock are shifted onto a feed diet, if the feed is has higher nutrition, yeah, it's more nutritious and is a higher quality diet, the livestock methane and nitrous oxide emissions can be lower. And so that's why this blue line pops out here. But this yellow here would be the feed emissions that you would need in order to achieve this gain in plant biomass to sequester soil carbon. And so the key thing there is that this feed emission offsets a pretty big chunk of the amount of CO2 that you would sequester in plants and soils. Now, what we found when we put that all together is that mitigation potential is around 10 to 32% lower globally when you begin to account for these associated emission changes with implementing this nature-based solution. And here you're looking at a graph where I basically squished all those colors together, where this is soil carbon and plant biomass carbon sequestration, and then this total net emission bar. And the difference between the two is essentially slicing out any sort of additional emissions from feed production. And what you can see is that different countries have very different mitigation potentials, right? And how accounting for feed production reduces those mitigation potentials. So in Brazil, it cuts into it quite a bit. Tanzania, it all but eliminates it. Australia doesn't change it all too much. Mongolia reduces it just a little bit. US, they're very close. So the key thing here is that, sure, you can store a lot of carbon in plants and soils. That we're not debating, but depending on the management practice that you choose to use to get there can matter a lot. And it varies across the globe, largely based on where you're getting your feed from, what the relative productivity is of those rangelands already, and a few other management factors like how manure is managed. Now, one of the cool things that Robert did is he also said, what are the variables that are driving this variability? So if we look at the feed emissions, we look at livestock emissions, as well as displaced production emissions, what are really which of these three things are the cause of, I'll go back, the difference between these two bars? So when I talk about mitigation potential being lower, why is it lower? And what you can see in Africa and in South America and Asia, really it's feed emissions that's moving the needle. Depending on where you are in those different continents, whether or not you see large net emission reductions depends effectively on how your feed emissions change and this livestock emissions component, which would be the methane emissions and nitrous oxide emissions from the livestock that are still there. So we thought this was a really neat analysis because it also tells us something about, okay, what can we begin to optimize for in different regions to try to increase the net emission reduction potential. But first, what we did was we wanted to understand, we have this global map, did this big analysis. Where do the projects, the existing nature-based solution projects for carbon credits exist, and how do they fall? Where do they fall on this map, and what are our estimates for changes in their mitigation potential? So what we did is we went to the Vera project database, and we took all of the projects that either exist or have been proposed to take place across all the different countries that we had data for. So this is Tanzania, Kenya, and China. And we estimated what's the well, first of all, we took the ecosystem carbon that that project estimates they can sequester. So when an area, let's say I own a massive swath of rangeland and I want to get paid for my carbon credits. I say, all right, I want my carbon sequestration potential to be appraised. I'm going to submit it to a verification body. And then that verification body is going to tell me how much carbon I can potentially sequester. And I'm going to sell my carbon credits on the market. What this green bar is that estimate of ecosystem carbon sequestration. And what this dot here is our estimate of what their actual net emission mitigation potential is when you begin to account for all these other factors. And the important thing is that across essentially the majority of these countries where projects exist, when you begin to account for feed emissions, for changes in methane and nitrous oxide, from displaced production, where livestock are now grown in areas that can result in greater emissions because of deforestation, things like that. The mitigation potential really drops quite a bit. In some areas, more so than others, China seems to be pretty robust, and the United States as well. Emissions don't change all that much. But the take home from this is that a lot of projects that exist on the market that are saying they're going to sequester a large amount of carbon in plants and soils are probably overestimating their sequestration potential when you look across the entire supply chain. So take home, ecosystem carbon dioxide removal, sure, biophysically feasible. You can do it in many locations across the globe. But whether or not you're implementing a solution that results in net emission reductions, it's really sensitive to management and the supply chain. You can't just look at how much carbon a patch of soil can store. And then finally, I would go to say that altered grazing on rangelands, it's not a globally feasible solution. Betsy and I were chatting about this at lunch, saying maybe you should look elsewhere. We're like, stop deforesting the Amazon, stop draining peatlands, etc. But I do think it's what was interesting from this analysis is basically the number of knobs that are turning in order to calculate the net emission reduction potential in these projects. And all of those knobs require a load of assumptions. And I'm happy to talk about that afterwards. And so this is just my acknowledgements, and these are nice island cattle from the sky.
Questions for Adam?
Yes, please.
If I were to raise my cattle here at my feet, does do these carbon fishes get
Yeah. So I did not do that data set and model justice. It's all of the emissions that have gone into maybe clearing the land that the feed is grown on, the machinery that's used to grow that, the fuel, the electricity, the nitrogen fertilizer, like all of those emissions, as well as the post-production transport emissions. So that was a collaborator. We used collaborators that had created that data set. But yeah, good question. Yes. Yeah, that's a great question. We did not in this analysis, but the pipeline for the analysis that we set up, you could definitely do that, because for our data set, I forgot to say this, it's centered around the year 2015, because obviously livestock densities change, etc. And so what you could do is you could say, all right, we have this map, we know the amount of livestock, we have food balance sheets from the FAO, so we know how much feed the livestock are getting and what its composition is. So you could easily roll in something like an estimate of methane reduction, methane block. Yeah. Please.
Yes, just so I got
Yeah, yeah, it does. But in the idea behind it is that if the quality of feed is higher, it's easier for it to be digested. And as a consequence, there's less methane produced during that digestion process per kilogram of protein that the livestock is producing. Does that make sense? So it's like if you're being grown on a more efficient product, you're being slaughtered faster, and so you've emitted less methane throughout. So that's how it's at least calculated in these IPCC tier 2 equations. But you can imagine it also depends on the forage and feed, or the forage quality in the area that you're currently existing in. So in some cases, grasses can be very palatable, or it can be sown, there can be legumes in that area as well. And so the feed supplementation may not give you as big of a bump in reducing methane and nitrous oxide emissions. And so that's why we use those particular models, because it allows us to capture that. Does that make sense? Okay.
It looked like in the US, the cattle density was low. There wasn't a lot of room for improvement there, but I'm wondering about feedlots. Where are we currently getting the feed for the feedlot part?
We didn't analyze feedlots. We just looked at rangelands. So there's been a number of studies by this Steve Davis, as well as Pete Smith, and then the GLEAM group, which is the Global Livestock Emissions, is in there somewhere, that have calculated these types of estimates. And so the key thing with our map is it's not just the density of livestock, it's the density of livestock relative to the productivity of the vegetation that's there. So we used remote sensing data to estimate the net primary productivity of the rangelands. And we used the density and composition of livestock in each grid cell to put into our model to estimate the amount of forage that they would be consuming to calculate this relative stocking density. And so you could have a relative stocking density be low, even if you had a ton of livestock, if it was very productive. So that it can be slightly misleading. And but yeah, the feedlot, I throw my hands up. I don't know the exact answer to the question.
I have two questions. One is whether there are any national scale programs that are looking at using livestock density changes that you've been engaging with. And second was I was hoping you could go back maybe 3-ish global maps. You had one which showed Australia with huge amounts of displaced emissions, different than, oh yeah, that's the one. What's that pink mean?
Yeah, so the pink is essentially if you shift production within a country to a more productive area. So let's say I'm growing a bunch of cows here, but the productivity of the plants is low, the quality of the forage is low, and the feed emissions are high. What if I grew those livestock somewhere else? So that's more of a we know supply chains aren't that stick, right? That would rarely happen, but it's one of the proposed pathways of redistributing your supply chain to grow livestock in more efficient areas. So that's one way of interpreting that, is you could redistribute livestock production into areas that are less intensive, less emission intensive. In the national question, as far as like a coordinated program, no. But all of these right here, I mean, they're sanctioned by the governments. That's been a big thing with Kenya and Tanzania, right? Kenya displaced a bunch of the Maasai in order to facilitate natural climate solution investment. And I mean, most of these are companies that are driving it, right? Like Tyson has this climate smart beef, which is, yeah. So in Cargill, for example, in their emissions reduction report, they claimed like something 30% of their potential emission reduction will be on improved livestock production via like soil carbon sequestration. So it pops up. I mean, Cargill's a bigger emitter than many countries in the globe. And so it pops up as being very important, just not necessarily in the national scheme.
Yeah, that's cool. That the corporate side is the other obvious place to go. I just wonder if any of these countries might be thinking about this pathway in their nationally determined contributions through the IPCC mechanism and would really like to talk to you.
Yeah, and certainly they in their NDCs they have livestock production flagged, but whether they're, you know, the amount of coordination, I'm sure you guys can all appreciate far more so than I can. It's made up of all these, you know, local entities and players who have different motivations and pressures on them. So I think from a country scale, I mean, very few countries are probably coordinated and heavy-handed enough that they'd be able to implement this, whereas a company can change who they get their suppliers from and require suppliers to do particular things. So my hope is that by doing analyses like this, even though, you know, it's kind of crazy to say, all right, this project is located here, what's its emission reduction potential? Like, I'm not saying we're, you know, giving very precise estimates, but what I hope that a company would take away from with this graph is that they probably shouldn't just think about ecosystem. They should require a project to report all their net emissions. More?
Okay, from Amartya, reduced grazing equals increased biomass and incremental soil OM upon litter fall and decomposition. However, over what time period is the gain considered? For instance, fire can burn the biomass off and resets the system.
Yeah. So in this case, all these experiments, well, the experiments that we analyzed on average lasted 11 years, and they were implementing their experimental design was, for the most part, they had a field with some grazer density that was representative of what they were doing, I don't know, X number of years beforehand. They wouldn't not always report that. And then they would have a field where they shifted the grazer density. And after a few years, they would sample the soil carbon. So that a few years on average was 11 years across all of our sites, but it ranged from 1 to 91 years. And I totally agree. I mean, these changes can be transient. And that's one thing that Courtney, my postdoc, is actually working on, is what are the mechanisms behind the transience and stability of soil carbon with grazing as well as fire. Yeah, good question. Did that answer it?
I think so. Yes, I'm already said yes. One more question from Hillary. What other trade-offs for low to moderate grazing would you like to add into your analysis to look at overall ecosystem values, not just carbon storage?
Overall ecosystem values, meaning yeah, biodiversity. I mean, I think in order to qualify as a nature-based climate solution, you have to at least make sure you're not reducing biodiversity. I think that really tricky thing in the literature that we really struggled with was that you often hear about increasing grazing intensity at low grazer densities being good for the ecosystem, either stimulating plant productivity, maybe increasing plant biodiversity. But the evidence for that is really sparse. So I think I would hesitate to say going from low to high would give a lot of benefits. I'm at the scale that we're analyzing. As far as other ecosystem benefits from altered grazing density, generally, I would say that if plant net primary productivity is going up in these systems, they're not like intensively managed pastures with a bunch of planted African grass that's totally a monodominant. So if plant productivity is going up in some of these areas, you might expect other um, uh, things like biodiversity of plants going up as well. And that's one thing that we're analyzing by actually sampling a number of different sites that have altered grazer density as, or sorry, not productivity, biodiversity.